he served as chief U.S. trade negotiator with Japan and Canada, and as general counsel of the Office of U.S. Trade Representative during the Clinton administration. Those were heady days for trade, so you know, because he was centrally involved in negotiations leading to the NAFTA agreement and also the multilateral Uruguay round, which was a singular achievement and probably the high point of multilateral negotiations, maybe forever, but certainly up till now. He also successfully resolved contentious bilateral disputes between the U.S. and Japan on automobiles and semiconductors. He said at lunch today that it was just coincidence that he was on the scene during some of the most important international trade negotiations and disputes that this country has had in the post-war period. As an international lawyer, Mr. Shapiro has advised clients on international trade matters, market access, and intellectual property rights. He's also played a key role on the legal team that won 2 landmark victories at the WTO in cases against China, representing the U.S. motion picture, recording, and publishing industries. I should say that another part of our discussion at lunch today was, what should the president be doing by comparison with what is he doing? And one of the things that I think there's general agreement about is that intellectual property rights need better protection, that is really the lifeblood of the American economy these days in many respects. And that's what we should be focusing our attention on. It happens, of course, that Mr. Shapiro knows a great deal about that. He served for 12 years in senior staff positions in the Senate, was part of the legal teams that helped the presidential candidates select their vice presidential running mates in 1992 and in 2000. He is the author of The Last Great Senate, Courage and Statesmanship in a Time of Crisis, which is a narrative history of the U.S. Senate in the late 1970s. And his new book is called Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? He came all the way out here and he didn't bring a carton of books with him, which is more the pity because I'm sure some of you would like to have signed copies, but you can find it on Amazon. I will repeat it. It is Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? His topic today for this discussion is America and the World, the Senate role in trade policy and national security. I think he's going to speak for 45 minutes and then we'll have a general discussion. But I should ask you, Ira, do you want to be interrupted with questions as you go along, or would you prefer just to, that is clarificatory questions, or do you want to just make your talk and wait?
No, people can ask, that's fine.
Okay. Ira Shapiro. Ambassador Ira Shapiro.
So, I have to begin with a few caveats. Despite, in addition to the usual charisma challenge when you're my age, I have a slight cold, so I may not be projecting as well as I otherwise would. The other thing is, as I told Bob, one of the real challenges for a speaker is knowing whether to wear a tie. I'm not wearing this tie because I'm old or a stiff. I'm wearing it to be respectful. And next time I won't.
I'm wearing mine because I'm old and I'm stiff.
I'm delighted to be here, and I kind of wear 2 hats these days. I'm an former international trade negotiator, and I've made a living in international trade. I care a lot about the trade issues of the day, and they're obviously fascinating, and that's why you're here for the most part, and so that's the way we'll focus most of this. But I also am a student of the Senate, and I became something of a Senate historian by accident, essentially. I was waiting to go back into government, which is my real love, and realized we kept losing elections. Democrats were losing elections, and I wasn't going to go back into government. And so, to supplement what I was doing, I started writing about the Senate when it was great. Coincidentally, when I was there. My publisher said to me, no one's interested in your memoir. And I said, fine, it won't be a memoir. And he also said, it shouldn't be political science because no one's interested in political science. It has to be narrative history. You have to tell the story. And so I wrote a book called The Last Great Senate, which captured the Senate over a 4-year period. And the reason I wrote the book was because the Senate had been a big part of my life. It drew those in my demographic, and there are a handful of people in the room like that. We were drawn to the Senate during the last crisis that faced the country, 50 years ago, Vietnam, the violence in the cities, the Chicago Convention, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Johnson's taken into the wrong direction when he escalated in Vietnam. For many of us, the Senate was a beacon of hope. And so it drew me into public service. I went to work in the Senate. You'll find a lot of people in Washington whose names are better known than mine, whether it's Bill Clinton or Chris Matthews, Madeleine Albright, Susan Collins or Lamar Alexander, George Will or Mark Shields. A lot of people started out as Senate staffers. It was, in the words of Hamilton, it was the room where it happened at that time. So the Senate meant a lot to me, and I spent 12 years there. I started writing about it because I was troubled about its long decline. So about the time when President Obama came into office, I started working on the first book about the Senate. My hope was, even as I wrote it, that the election of President Barack Obama would change the downward course of our government. I may have been naive, but I certainly was wrong. Despite Obama's ability and his leadership, the failure of the Senate, the obstruction of the Senate, the long decline of the Senate neutralized a lot of what the president would have otherwise hoped to have accomplished for the country. So my wife said to me, as I was coming out here, she said, your audience is interested in a lot of things, so don't get on to one of your obsessive kicks about Mitch McConnell. I am somewhat obsessed about Mitch McConnell. I will say that at the front, and then I will set it aside to come back to it later. I think he's been a uniquely bad actor for a variety of reasons, but I'll get off Mitch McConnell. To shift to looking at the Senate for a moment. The whole idea of the Senate, the most powerful upper house in the world, was that we should have a strong Senate, in part as a check against what the founders feared, an overreaching president, and a House of Representatives that was consumed by the passions of the day. And when you think about it, that sounds like a pretty good idea about now. A Senate that was strong enough to check an overreaching president and offset a House of Representatives that was consumed by the passions of the day. So it'd be good to have that kind of Senate. The only problem is, in my judgment, the Senate that I wrote about, a Senate of unique accomplishment in the 60s and 70s, that Senate's been going down for 25 or 30 years. And I would say the trajectory is that it had been going down gradually for a long period of time until about 10 years ago. And then it started into a deep dive. And the reason it started into a deep dive 10 years ago and there's McConnell again. But the reason it started into a deep dive is that Senate leaders had traditionally regarded it as their obligation to work together to try to make the Senate work. And 10 years ago, Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell decided that wasn't the way to do it. So Reid became the leader of the Democrats, and McConnell became the leader of the Republicans, and we've had tribal politics ever since. I won't say that they're totally responsible for our tribal politics, but I would say they have a significant amount to do with the creation and maintenance of tribal politics. So the good thing about being a speaker at this point in time where you're touching on the Senate is you don't actually have to convince people it's important, given the pending Kavanagh nomination. And you don't have to convince people that it's broken, given the bitter partisanship that we're all aware of. So those are good starting points for talking about the Senate. But I promised to talk about the Senate role with respect to trade and national security, which is my other love, basically, trade policy. So if you think about it for a moment, early on when Donald Trump won his narrow victory, the historian Walter Russell Mead, who's a very good historian, wrote that for the first time in 70 years, the American people have elected a president who disparages the policies, ideas, and institutions at the heart of the post-war U.S. foreign policy. This was a departure from anything we had ever had. Since 1945, there was some consensus, a strong bipartisan consensus, about what America's role in the world was, and the role of American presidents in providing that leadership. Donald Trump was pretty clear in his campaign, and then afterward, that he didn't buy any of that. And there is actually an intellectual, he doesn't always articulate it that way, but the historian Mead pointed out that basically President Trump was essentially what he calls a Jacksonian populist, going back to Andrew Jackson. Jackson didn't believe that Jackson believed in a strong America, but it was internally focused. It was focused on the American nation state. It didn't have a role in the world. The idea was our exceptionalism would be demonstrated at home. Now, subsequently, there were other models, the Hamiltonian model, where you've got a global role because you want the world economy to work. The Wilsonian model, you've got a global role because you stand for liberal values and human rights. And one might say, Jackson's like 200 years ago, right? So what happened the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, and particularly the catastrophe of World War II, led to the American role in the global order. There was an agreement on what America ought to do, the institutions that ought to be created, and American leadership in the global order. So, and all the presidents, Democratic and Republican, kind of supported that until Donald Trump. He has a different view of it. Now, if that's the case, if President Trump, leaving aside the irregularities of the election, set them aside, he won the presidency narrowly, he's the president. He has a dramatically different view of America in the world, which he calls America first, and I sometimes call America versus the world. His view is different. So the question is, in our system, does one person change everything? It's an interesting question. We're supposed to have an Article I Congress and an Article II President. leaving aside the court for a moment. The Congress used to have a significant role in policy making. Over the course of a long period of time in this century, we've become a presidential nation more. The Congress has receded. Presidents, we can all say it started at FDR, but it probably went further back to Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. The presidents became stronger. But this question of whether one person, narrowly elected, can change the direction of the country, can change the relationships that we have maintained with everyone else in the world, that's, I think, a large question. And so, for me, that's where kind of the Senate, and the House as well, but particularly the Senate, ought to come into play. That the Senate ought to have some role in asserting itself. If they don't like what the president's doing, they ought to do something about it. So, I guess the question is, how are they doing? And the answer is, they're not doing great. I would argue they're not doing as badly as one might suspect. I mean, given the fact that we all regard them as a total catastrophe, I think the record is a little more mixed than that. And let me tell you why. So, think about, there's a few areas of foreign policy, and we will spend most of our time on trade, but there's a few areas where the President Trump wanted to change the way the country is relating to the world. One of them is immigration and border security. We've been a nation that's been open to immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants. We had a liberalized immigration policy, and frankly, some people would say we've had a liberalized immigration policy for so long that the country has changed in many ways, and so there's some reaction against that, which Trump epitomizes and intensifies. When the president started with his travel ban right out of the box, there was an enormous public reaction against it. He was slapped down by some courts, but also the senators spoke out against it. They did, and they tried to legislate. They've tried to legislate to protect the dreamers. They've tried over the years to come up with comprehensive immigration legislation. They haven't succeeded. But they have neutralized to some degree what he's trying to do. They watch with some intense interest his efforts to build and fund the wall, and they've slapped him down on the border wall. So I would say if you were looking at immigration, they're aware of what's going on. They've tried to come up with a comprehensive solution. They haven't succeeded, but they have pushed back to some degree. B minus, C plus, look for some grade there. A second area, though, that I just want to touch on because people don't necessarily think about it. President Trump, early in his term, was struggling with the decision whether to take us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. 190 nations in the Paris Climate Agreement. And President Trump decides in his infinite wisdom that we will leave the Paris Agreement. On that point, I would give the Senate pretty much of a zero, a failing grade. The senators I worked with, and he was, you may recall, he was debating this sort of publicly for a couple of weeks. The Europeans put him over the top. The one thing that's, he went to Europe and Angela Merkel said to him at some point, it's 6-1 against you, 7-1 if you count the European Union. And you're thinking, Donald Trump, that's about the worst way to talk to him, right? France and Germany and Italy and the UK, and we're all against you, and the European Union. So he takes us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The senators that I worked with and saw over the years, and chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee like Richard Lugar of Indiana or Charles Percy of Illinois, they may not have been able to stop it. It's a presidential decision. But they would have had hearings. They would have spoken out. They would have highlighted what was wrong with doing that. None of that happened. None of that happened. Bob Corker, who I sometimes refer to as Big Talker Bob Corker, he's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and nothing happened. So on that, I would give the Senate clear F, right? Failing grade. So let's talk about trade. So Donald Trump didn't discover steel workers or the trade issue. Steel and steel workers have been an issue in trade as long as I can remember. Before I got into trade, it started in the late 70s with one of the recessions at that time. As a country, we have been debating trade intensely for at least 25 years since NAFTA, and actually back from the 80s when we started with Japan. I would say that the trade argument has been the most consistently fierce, full, and fair argument that we've had. It actually is an argument that members of Congress really understand. They understand it. They understand the economics of their state or their district. They have been intensely involved in it. And if you look at it, what you discover is, over the years, it's the one area where the debate has actually been very robust. The pro-trade forces have won some significant victories, whether it was NAFTA and the Uruguay round or some of the subsequent trade agreements. The anti-trade forces have won significant victories. They blocked a lot of things over time. But the debate was fierce. And it culminated actually while Trump was running in the debate over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In 2015, Barack Obama was championing this thing. He got the Trade Promotion Authority to finish the agreement by a narrow margin. Fierce debate. If you look at our politics, which have been completely non-functional on health care, bitterly partisan, no real debate, no real effort to work something out. On the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was a healthy debate. People crossed party lines, people made compromises, they did the things that legislators are supposed to do, and Obama was given the authority to finish the agreement, which his trade representative did. And then President Trump came into office and abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But as I was talking to Bob about, the truth was that there were Democrats who were against it. Hillary Clinton shifted her position on it because there was so much opposition in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders was fiercely against it. Members of Congress were against it. If Trump had a mandate for anything, I would say he had a mandate to leave the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though it was a terrible idea to do so. Terrible idea. So, okay, so that's sort of the background. So what's happened this year? So we have a president who basically declared essentially trade war against everybody, right? I mean, at different times, Canada, Mexico, Germany, the European Union, Korea, Australia, Japan, and of course China. So virtually everybody. So what would be the right trade policy for the U.S., which is not to say it's easy to figure out? We have a real challenge, trade and competitive challenge from China. Any president, Democratic or Republican, who came to office in 2016, I think would have felt the need to try to find a tougher trade policy with respect to China. But if you were doing that, you wouldn't abandon the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You wouldn't declare a trade war against Canada and Mexico. You wouldn't leave the Paris Climate Agreement. You know, there's a lot of things you wouldn't do. So I think that the president has embarked on a trade policy that is not in our interest. Has the Senate responded to it? Basically, I give them sort of, I would argue they get more like a B or a B minus. What happened was, right from the beginning, senators at the very first hearing that USTR Bob Lighthizer went up to the Hill, the senators were against NAFTA withdrawal. They basically were trying to explain to him, North American supply chains, these are important. You represent agricultural interests who are deeply concerned that they're going to be retaliated against. The auto industry, the steel industry, these are integrated North American industries. So they pushed back from the beginning. One can argue that they should have done more legislatively. They could have said, as Jeff Flake and Bob Corker have suggested, this abuse of the national security, claiming national security justifies steel and aluminum tariffs, that's an abuse, and we will legislate to limit the use of Section 232. And there have been efforts made to do that, but none of them have advanced. But I would say that they have accomplished something. I think that given his druthers, the president would have taken us out of NAFTA a long time ago. He has chosen not to do so so far. As you know, a bilateral agreement was reached with Mexico, and there's has been until now, a continuing effort to extend that to Canada. We'll see how that plays out. But I think that they have played some useful role in trade, although not as far as I would have wanted them to go. Historically, trade has been divided between the President and Congress. The Constitution gives Congress the authority over trade under Article 1, interstate and foreign commerce. But only the President, the executive branch, can negotiate. And so they split the authority, as you know. So there's a give and take. That's happened over years. Where Trump is different is this is the first president who comes out on the protectionist side. Traditionally, the presidents have been the advocates of global trade and open trade. And Congress pushes back, and they jostle each other, and we muddle across the finish line on agreements or don't reach agreements. But this has been a real change to have a president who is on the protectionist side. So, those are three areas of foreign policy, and when we open up the discussion, we'll talk more about trade. Let me give one other area, though, that I do think is ultimately going to be the decisive one. We will judge this Senate in history for whether it protects the investigation of Special Counsel Robert Mueller and if it protects the investigation, how it judges it, essentially, after it comes out. And by judging it, I don't necessarily mean at the end of an impeachment. In our political system, I know you know this, but the senators are like the Greek chorus, right? I mean, something happens and then 10 senators are on the Sunday talk shows. They have a position in our political debate that's unique. When Mueller reports, if the report is, as I believe it will be, a severe criticism, severe indictment, not in the criminal sense, but severe indictment for the moment, how does the public judge it when President Trump pushes back and calls it false news, does what he's going to do, disparages the Justice Department, disparages the FBI, disparages Mueller? It falls to the senators to help mediate it, to help explain it. And it has always been the case that a handful of Republican senators would have a decisive role in that. So I take some encouragement from the fact that they have been protective of the Mueller investigation up to this point. Now, some would disagree with that. Some would say there was legislation to protect the investigation and it wasn't put into place. And I think that's true. But many of the senators have made it absolutely clear to President Trump that they would not support firing Mueller, firing Rosenstein. That's a fairly current subject, actually. It's nice to be talking about things that are on people's minds. So I would say on the protection of it's been my judgment, and I wrote this in my book, that once the president fired FBI Director James Comey, once the allegations of Russian interference in the election became clearer and clearer, I think the senators started separating that issue from the other issues on which they were rolling over to the president. And I think that when they don't speak out, and they don't speak out as much as I would like, but when they don't speak out, it's because they think they have the best special counsel already at work. They're waiting for Mueller, essentially. So, all right, I've gone almost as far as I'm going to go without returning to Mitch McConnell. You can't get off your obsession. So let me try to, and I want to leave a lot of time, this is a manageable group, so I want to leave some time for discussion and questions. But let me talk about Mitch McConnell. And I'll talk about him by saying that historically, when the Senate worked well, it was because it had leaders who operated in a certain way. And the certain way is, I used to call it the Great Senate. I discovered the Great Senate, by the way. In my first book, if you get on Google, put in the words Great Senate, you'll find nothing other than my book. The words have never been used together. But after the book came out, people actually said, yeah, that was kind of a distinctive Senate. 60s and 70s, I wrote about the late 70s. A distinctive Senate, different than what had come before and different than what has come since. A lot of accomplishments. The Senate we look to for civil rights, for opposing the Vietnam War, for holding Nixon accountable during Watergate. A lot of accomplishments. They operated in a certain way. Bipartisan, because that's the way the Senate was supposed to work. High levels of trust, because that was nurtured by the leaders, starting with Mike Mansfield, who was the greatest Senate leader. Even though Lyndon Johnson is more famous, Mike Mansfield was actually the greatest Senate leader. I do a whole thing on Mansfield, so I can't do justice to him in 2 minutes. Bipartisan trust. Country first, in John McCain's phrase. Yeah, they were Democrats or Republicans. They had interests representing each of their individual states, but they knew they were there for a national purpose. And they were there to take collective action. That was what the Senate was supposed to do. They were supposed to step up and deal with the nation's problems. Take collective action. Debate, and then compromise, or debate, not compromise, vote up or down. Take action. One problem at a time. There's a book, in my first book, there's a year 1978, 40 years ago exactly. Jimmy Carter's president. Not the most effective president of all time, although he accomplished a lot more than anyone would suspect. 1978, the Senate passes the Panama Canal Treaty. It passes the centerpiece of Carter's energy legislation. It gives F-15s to the Saudis to make the Middle East peace process move ahead. It debates labor law reform and rejects it after five cloture votes. And then in the summer, after it's done all this, it comes up with a financial rescue for New York City. Within weeks, they deal with the problem in a very creative way. One thing after another. That's how they used to do business. It wasn't just partisan posturing and partisan warfare. So, what happened? I said early that the Senate under Reid and McConnell took a dramatic turn for the worst. It became a very partisan enterprise. And McConnell, in my judgment, is the most effective political strategist and tactician of our era. If power is the ability to get your objectives and prevent your opponents from getting theirs, nobody has been more effective than McConnell. But there's been a high cost. He's done incredible damage to the Senate by making it a totally partisan institution, and he's created a situation where the country can't rely on the Senate, and the country counts on the Senate. It was the place where the parties came together. Walter Mondale, who I was hoping to see today, but he's, as Bob said, at a funeral, not mine, fortunately. It was the place where the parties came together. He called it the nation's mediator. And that was a great phrase. I use that phrase a lot. There has to be a place where problems get worked out. There hasn't been for a long time. And my argument, my bottom line argument is that it's possible to give a speech about American politics without even mentioning Donald Trump, even though we're fixated on him. I think the crisis in American democracy started about 25 or 30 years ago with the decline of the Senate. I think the failure of the Senate opened the door to an outsider. I think people could legitimately look at the situation and say, Washington is failing us. We ought to try something different. And so I regard Trump as essentially the effect of the long decline of the government, but the Senate's failure, to which I attribute much to McConnell, I think is the cause. So, gotten through the whole thing without even talking about Brett Kavanaugh. Let's open it up for questions and discussion. Thanks for everybody coming here. Thanks for letting me try to weave my two obsessions, the Senate and trade, together.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's have some questions. They needn't be on trade. They can be on these other subjects.
They can be on Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
My current obsession.
So, thank you so much for sharing with us your thoughts. Well, one of the main purposes of our year here is to understand better the position of US when it comes to global politics and global affairs. We are ahead of the November elections. And in case we, the Social Democrats, are lucky enough, there will be an overturn of the majority in the Congress. When it comes to a problematic president whose emotional intelligence is predominant over the institutions, what would be the best institutional response when it comes to his actions? And would impeachment be a good option when it comes to the US posture in global terms?
Well, I should have said at the outset, obviously I'm a Democrat. I've been a Democrat all my life. But I've worked with a lot of Republicans. And I had a soft spot for them for a long time. When I first came to the Senate to work, the first two elections brought in Republicans, John Hines, John Chafee, John Danforth. There's one other John. Okay, I'll come. John Hines, John Chafee, Don Danforth. Yeah, I'll think of the other one. Bill Cohen, Nancy Kassebaum, Alan Simpson. A lot of moderates, a lot of moderate conservatives, people you could admire as Republicans, people who turned out to be very good senators. It's hard to disconnect the current political situation from the long madness that has affected the Republican Party for about 20 years. Going back, maybe 25 years, going back to Newt Gingrich, the Republican Party changed. And so, I didn't fear a Republican Senate back in the 80s. I hated it because I lost my job, etc. I didn't fear it. You know, it's a right of Senate, but it worked like a Senate. But now, this Senate has been a disaster for the country. This House has been a disaster for the country. So, I think the country would be far better off with a Democratic House and hopefully a Democratic Senate to check the president in ways that could lead up to impeachment but wouldn't necessarily. From my standpoint, everything that Trump does should be handled through the normal political process of elections, 2018 and 2020, except for what Mueller is looking at. If the special counsel finds obstruction of justice and collusion with the Russians in the interference in our election, I think that is certainly grounds for impeachment and removal. And so I distinguish that from politics as usual. And we'll see how that plays out. I think that that's the point at which the country will decide on how serious the Mueller indictment is and whether it warrants the removal of the president. My position has been, when asked about it, I think this is such an aberrational presidency, and if that is shown to be part of this, I think he should be forced out of office. Other people have said to me, nah, keep him around another 18 months. Putting in Mike Pence would just be a disaster. And Trump supporters would not accept impeachment. they would need an election. So we'll see how it plays out. In the back.
Yes. Mr. Shapiro, thank you so much for your nice talk discussion. I'm Anahita Semidinova from Tajikistan, Central Asia. So can I ask a question about Afghanistan, or
Sure.
just your opinion about the war in Afghanistan? What do you think, because we know about the situation there, and for many centuries, it's like there is no solution to solve this Afghan problem. But now, what do you think, what will be in next 2 years? Because now Russia tries to solve this problem in Afghanistan, and soon they will host a conference in Moscow. And what do you think about the role of US? Do you think it was, this war, it was like failed war, or it was like this strategy, what will be next? What do you think about the situation in Afghanistan?
I think it's possible you're asking me something that I'm not expert enough in. I mean, I have, obviously, like all students of American policy, I'm interested in Afghanistan, but I don't profess to be an expert in it. I think that the United States has been involved in Afghanistan for a long time, and there's a certain feeling of futility, but every time any president looks at it, they conclude that leaving would be worse. I understand recent efforts, again, to re-engage the Taliban. I'm not fond of the Taliban, and I don't think anybody can have great confidence that the Taliban would be a very good negotiating partner. So I don't know what's going to happen in Afghanistan. One of the interesting things, I believe, that what's been going on in the US, President Trump very much would like to get us out of Afghanistan. And to some extent, he's tapped into a little bit of some of the frustrations that Obama had. And look, going back 50 years or so, George McGovern ran for president on a policy of, his slogan was "Come Home, America," from Vietnam. So there's always that question, do we engage internationally? Are we accomplishing anything, etc.? I don't know how it's going to turn out.
Going back to trade.
Something that's not Afghanistan.
Yeah. But your thoughts, multilateralism versus bilateralism, the negotiation, those are different theories, or different approaches. Your thoughts on the strengths or weaknesses of each of them?
I was involved, as Bob said, in the completion of the Uruguay round, which was sort of the high water mark, supposedly, of multilateralism, created the WTO and the WTO dispute settlement system. So, that was a long time ago. I think that criticisms of the system are certainly warranted, and the Doha round was not, it didn't just fail at the end, it failed at every moment. It was a failure and doomed to be a failure, and it shouldn't have been done, and it shouldn't have been continued. And I think it eroded any confidence in multilateral negotiation. I think there are certain kind of multilateral, sort of sectoral negotiations that could be successful. But I think the system has been in trouble because it has failed, number one, and because everyone looking at it sort of went off and started cutting their bilateral deals or their regional deals. And while all of us, anyone in the trade world would say this isn't the best way to proceed, it's kind of hard to put that genie back in the box. So, where does that leave you? I think if you were the President of the United States you would be looking at regional and bilateral deals of certain kinds because you have to do that to compete. I think you can do certain things in the multilateral system to try to make it work. You certainly wouldn't be trying to destroy the dispute settlement system, which is what the administration appears to be doing. Bob Lighthizer, the trade representative, is someone I've known for many years. Bob genuinely hates the WTO. He didn't want us to join it to begin with. And at the moment, he's in the process of undermining it. The dispute settlement body, I think there were 7 appellate judges. Now we're down to about 3. So he's trying to destroy it in that way. I hope that other nations won't let that happen. I don't think, I mean, there's a place for all different kinds of negotiations. You know, bilateral, regional, and multilateral. But I think if you turn to a total reliance on bilateral, it's a big mistake.
You had mentioned...
What about Kavanagh? Let's talk about Kavanagh. I mean, you know, this is my obsession for this week. I'll go back.
The Senate being in decline for a long time, and you cited Bob Corker as an example in his lack of sort of bringing up the Paris Climate Accords as we left them.
He would say in his defense that he played a good role on sanctions against Russia, which I believe is true.
And using the Paris Agreement as an example, if Bob Corker, I think he does, if he wanted out of the agreement himself, how do you, even if you disagree with his stance there, would his allowing us to depart, is that a sign of weakness on the Senate's part? If they're doing things we don't like, but they're doing things?
You mean, do they have to agree with me all the time to be acceptable? Well, there is some of that, of course. Actually, if I thought Corker, well, I'd say 2 things, or 3. If I thought Corker was opposed to the Paris Agreement, I would have regarded that as unfortunate, but I would have understood why he didn't do anything. He actually wasn't so opposed. He was just sort of all over the place on it. He said some things that indicated he thought there wasn't much to be gained by leaving it. So he wasn't a strong figure either way. So that's one part of it. I live with the memory of in this year 1978 that I'm obsessed with, when they bailed out New York City. The chairman of the banking committee, William Proxmire, was dead set against it. But he realized it was so important that he held hearings. He couldn't convince the committee what to do. When he was in the minority, he said, "I'll manage this bill." He went to the floor and he said, "I'm against bailing out New York City, but if you want to bail out New York City, this is the best piece of legislation there is." You know, it was a different time, of course, but, you know, one senator, the Senate had a role of what it ought to do, and even the Senate chairman had a role of how he related to the other senators.
I had a question. So you mentioned that you'd seen a decline in the Senate over the 20 years, and that seems like great hindsight to have. But if you were back at the start, so let's say, how would you foresee that? So if we're looking at now, how would we look to try to prevent further decline? Because it's much easier to look in the rear view mirror.
No, that's a great question. And because this isn't my full Senate talk, I didn't tell you how I would solve all these problems. I'm frustrated because I think, well, let me put it this way. Some people say, yeah, the Senate has declined because That was a unique group of people coming out of World War II, the Tom Brokaw's greatest generation. Or the Senate has declined because these are just more partisan times. I think there's some truth to that. They are more partisan times. But leaders still can bring people together as opposed to tearing them apart. They can instill trust rather than destroying it. So, there hasn't been a Senate rules change, serious look at the Senate rules since 1979. If you were to look at the rules, and I've suggested this a few times, and you would say, all right, do we really like the way the place is working? Do we think these frequent threatened filibusters, these indefinite holds that are paralyzing the place, these battles over judicial nominations are all necessary? You would say, let's look at it and try to figure out some rules that would go into effect, not this year, maybe when the next president comes in. And you could do it. You could find solutions to some of these problems. You could guarantee to a president, any president, that his nominees for the executive branch would be considered within 90 or 120 days. You might even say federal judges and Supreme Court justices would have to get 60 votes. But you would agree on it. The rules would be the same. The process, you wouldn't treat Democratic nominees one way and Republican nominees the other way. I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility. But we live in this intense, hyper-partisan times, and there's been no effort to do that.
Hi, my name is Natalie Minch. I just have a question for you more in regards to trade policy and national security. So obviously trade policy is important because it affects what we produce. And it sounds like from your talk that your argument was that certain trade policies that this administration have pursued have been abused by being categorized or implemented under the name of national security. And currently we have a $12 billion bailout and aid program to pay out the corn, cotton, dairy, hog, soy, wheat producers. And these farmers, some would say that these farmers and their ability to produce are critical to our food security and therefore are critical to national security. So do you still argue that there needs to be a motion to remove making trade policy in the name of national security? And under what conditions should trade policy be made in the name of national security, specifically in regards to agriculture?
That's a good question.
People use the term food security a lot
Yeah.
around universities these days.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess
I hope
Natalie,
they put that neutrally.
part of the background here is that the national security term has been used very narrowly historically. And indeed, countries there are defined areas that it really applies to, and they're narrow. There's always been a fear that among the nations, the trading nations, that if one invoked national security, you couldn't second guess them, but then everyone would start invoking national security for everything, and that it would get out of hand. Until now, that hasn't been a problem. People have refrained. People have exercised forbearance. The Trump administration has gone to use national security as its justification for the steel and aluminum tariffs, even though it's hard to make that argument that steel from Canada particularly is a national security threat. Then it sort of leads you to say, well, you know, what about the auto tariffs? That's national security. What about helping the farmers? That's national security. There's no end to it, essentially. For that reason, the Congress, some of the members of Congress are trying to conclude that they ought to put forth legislation that would redefine it in a way that limited the authority to be used. So I don't think the system works if you can just justify everything on the basis of national security.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that?
Yeah.
So you referenced like earlier that national security had a very narrow definition, but wars have changed quite a bit since World War II and how they conduct them. We really don't declare war like we did prior to World War II. So in that sense, shouldn't our vision of national security change with the times?
Cybersecurity.
Yeah, tough group. Yes. I mean, well, look, our defense, the things we worry about as a country and the things we have to defend against certainly have changed. But the question of whether, you know, a cyber threat of this sort leads you to sort of a broad conclusion that national security in the trade realm ought to change, you know, that, I mean, I guess I'm not a big fan of unilateralism. I don't know where, you know, it's hard to negotiate things bilaterally or multilaterally, but it's really not a very good system if you just decide everything on your own. So if cyber threats need to be addressed, I think they need to be addressed, but not under the existing trade rules.
I have one more follow-up question to that. What would you say?
He got his follow-up to you, and now you're back?
Last one, I swear.
This is going to be difficult.
What would you say that the current definition of national security is that you would go by? I've previously understood that countries can take the definition of national security and utilize a definition that reflects their own values. Is there any sort of legislation or policy that you would say provides a clear definition of national security to you?
No, you have to answer this. I got it. I'm kicking this over to you while I think about it.
This is an issue in the WTO now. And generally speaking, as you suggest, the WTO has given countries great latitude in deciding what's in their national security interest, and then other countries can object. And that's a matter of discretion. I mean, the success of the WTO is still a matter of diplomacy and discretion. It isn't like a domestic court. It involves the country's entire foreign policy. So I think the answer to your question is that the Trump administration is engaged in activities, as was mentioned under Section 232, the Trade Act, that sort of make a mockery of the national security exception to trade obligations. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you.
We had some others here too. Yes, sir.
I wanted to bring you back to something you mentioned at the very beginning, and that is intellectual property. One of the major issues that we have is that our intellectual property is often stolen. I think that's been mentioned, particularly with respect to China. What is being done and what should be done, in your opinion, to prevent this in the future?
Thanks. Well, we've been, I think as a country, through the U.S. Trade Representative's Office and others, I think we've been working on intellectual property protection for a long time. And it has been it's been a complex matter. Intellectual property protection in many countries is stronger than it used to be, because many countries have decided that intellectual property was worth protecting. And even in China, in certain ways, intellectual property is more protected than it used to be, but not in enough ways. So at different times, we have threatened China with sanctions, and we have brought WTO cases. I've been involved in some on copyright, piracy, etc. It's a hard slog. I think the most serious intellectual property questions are actually not just for the government. I think they're for our U.S. companies. If they think that they are being ripped off in China, they shouldn't be in China. I mean, you know, for a long time there was this great hope that China was liberalizing, that China was getting more protective of intellectual property. And it's been clear for years that that hasn't been the case. So now we have companies, I was going to say we have companies like Google. We don't have too many companies like Google. Now we have Google trying to figure out whether it will be in China and sacrifice some of its principles in order to stay in China. I think the companies have some power to decide whether they're going to do business there.
Does government have a role?
Government does have a role and continues to have a role, and I think, and as I said before, any administration that had come in now would be trying to figure out what to do on China and intellectual property violations. I think it's a combination, you do a combination of things which combine working with the companies, pressuring the Chinese government, joining with some of our allies or former allies to try to bring multilateral pressure. But at the end of the day, the progress is going to be slow. And the question of whether the companies stay there and make these deals that they've made is still a real question.
Maybe one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You spoke about how the decline in the Senate over the past decade or two has been attributed to the leadership and then becoming more extremely partisan and a breakdown in collaboration across the aisle. Would you say there's any other reasons other than that? Or is that the primary?
Yeah. In my full Senate talk, I say there are a bunch of other reasons. I mean, there's no doubt that politics are harder than they used to be. Harder to be a senator, harder to be in politics. The cost of campaigns, the 24/7 media, then the social media, then the weaponized social media, a lobbying corps that's 5 times as big as it used to be. You know, there's a lot of things that make it more difficult. I don't deny any of those. I simply believe that people are capable of doing better than they're doing even in that situation. And that my friend McConnell brings out the worst in everyone rather than the best. And I think that's a negation of what leadership is supposed to be. I think that look, the current circus over Judge Kavanagh is kind of a combination of, on the one hand, trying to ram through a nominee of extreme views, which was what concerned me before any of this other stuff. So we have those extreme views, and then we have the intersection with the accusations and the concerns about giving fair attention to the accusation. But I think that overall, having senators who act like senators is really an important thing. And when I sometimes get upset about the leaders. I'm not high on the followers either. I mean, they could push back. They don't have to accept the kind of leadership that they're getting. You know, they know. You may remember last year when Senator McConnell was trying to ram through the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It wasn't just Democrats that were concerned. Large number of Republican senators hated the policy and hated the process. But they didn't push back enough. And they have to be senators. They have to stand up. Now, the reason I sometimes get optimistic about it is that they know it's not supposed to be that way. They actually, it's really kind of amazing. They hate the institution they're in. And they hate it, and they say they hate it, but they don't change it, which is kind of remarkable.
I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last answer. Thank you.